On the gray morning, the women of the market were to collect 3 months of their own savings, the day every trader had counted toward through every lean week. The wealthy landlord who owned the market stood up before them in the rain, pointed at a poor single mother in a faded wrapper, and told the whole market that she had eaten their money, that the thrift box was empty, the savings gone, and that the woman they had trusted to keep their coins was a thief who had robbed them all. Folasade Bello did not scream, and she did not beg, and she did not run, though the gate was right behind her. She stood in the rain with the worn cloth ledger held against her chest, the book of thumbprints she had kept for 2 years without losing a single naira, and she let them believe she was a thief because there was nothing she could say into that wall of frightened, furious faces that they were ready to hear. And the landlord, who pointed at her, did not know, and the angry market did not know, that the empty thrift box and the missing money had a record, that every coin those women had ever handed her was written and thumbprinted in the book against her chest, and that the book would say plainly that the savings had been counted whole right up to the night they vanished from a place Folasade did not hold the key to. The market did the thing a frightened crowd does when its money is gone and someone has named a thief. It surged and it muttered, and the women who had handed Folasade their coins every dawn for 2 years looked at her now as if they had never known her, because fear is faster than memory, and a missing month of food money will turn a neighbor into a suspect in a single breath. A few of the older ones, who had watched her keep her word through every lean season, frowned and held back. Most pressed forward with the landlord's word already in their mouths, and Folasade felt the cold rain run down her neck, and the ledger press hard against her chest, and inside her, quiet and certain under all the noise, the one thing no shouting could take. She knew she had not touched their savings. She had counted it into the box the very night before, in front of the night watchman, exactly as she always did. She lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her over a cooking fire long ago, and she said nothing, because the truth she carried was written in a book, and a book does not need to shout. The landlord thought he was settling a problem, the way he settled every problem in his market, by deciding who was small enough to carry the blame and saying it loudly from a height where no one argued. He saw a faded wrapper, a single mother with no husband to speak for her, a woman who slept in a back room because she could not afford anywhere better, and he had decided, long before the rain, that she was the one the loss would be hung on. He had spent his whole comfortable life looking at people like Folasade and seeing only what they did not have. Folasade Bello was 28 years old, and in that market she was known by everyone and truly seen by almost no one. The small provision seller in the corner stall, the woman who measured out cups of rice and gari and tins of tomatoes for people who counted their coins as carefully as she counted hers. She rose each morning before the lorries came, in the narrow back room behind her kiosk where she slept with her child, swept her small patch of concrete, set out her goods on a wooden table worn smooth by her own hands, and stood behind it from first light until dusk for a profit so thin a single bad week could wipe it out. She was, everyone who dealt with her, agreed, scrupulously honest, exact with her measures, exact with her change. The kind of trader who would run after a customer down the lane to return 10 naira given by mistake. And she had learned long ago that being honest and being poor at the same time only meant people trusted you with their burdens and forgot to lighten your own. Folasade, the market women called her, the mother of Sade, and most of them did not know the half of what she carried. She had not planned to become the keeper of the market's money. The women of that market ran an ajo among themselves, the old thrift the poor have always used where banks will not have them. Each trader put in a fixed sum every day, squeezed out of small takings, and the pooled money was saved across the season toward the big needs: school fees, rent, restocking, the burials and weddings the poor must somehow find money for. Everything in such a thing depends on the one who holds the box, so it must be someone the whole market trusts with its hunger. 2 years before, when the old woman who had kept the thrift grew too frail, the traders chose Folasade, because in all her dealings, no one had ever caught her short by a single coin, and she had kept it properly. She did not trust her memory with other people's money, nor loose scraps of paper. She kept a ledger, a thick cloth-bound book she had bought new, the most expensive thing she owned, and in it, every woman of the thrift had her own page, and every day a trader put in her contribution. Folasade wrote the date and the amount in her small, careful hand, and the trader pressed her thumb beside it in ink, because many of the market women could not read or write, and a thumbprint was a thing no one could deny. Page by page, thumbprint by thumbprint, the book held the whole truth of the market's money, who had paid, how much, on what day, witnessed by their own marks. She kept it the way some people keep a deed to land, because it was the proof of her honesty made solid. She did not yet know how badly she would need it to speak. The thing every lean day and every careful entry was for was the child who slept in the back room behind the kiosk. Folasade was alone in raising her. The child's father had gone, and she did not spend her thin strength being bitter over a man who had chosen not to stay. She put aside a little of her own takings toward the one thing she wanted in the world, which was to lift her child out of that back room and that bare concrete into a life with a real floor under it, and school fees paid without fear. At night, when the market was dark and her child slept, she would sit by a small lamp and balance her own little book and promise the sleeping child, softly, that whatever else was poor about its mother, no one would ever be able to say her name was not clean. All she had was that: a clean name, a careful hand, and a thick cloth ledger full of other people's thumbprints, kept honest to the last coin. Here is the very thing this channel was built for, so let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever been the most trusted and the least protected person in a room, the one everybody leans on and nobody stands up for, and watched powerful people decide, the moment something went wrong, that the loss must be your fault because you were the easiest to blame and the hardest to defend, then you already belong here with us, under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the quiet, careful, overlooked people who carry everyone else's burdens and get accused first when something breaks are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what a rich man's pride was about to do to Folasade Bello, or what a worn book full of thumbprints was about to do right back. To understand the woman in the rain being called a thief, you have to understand the man who pointed at her. His name was Chief Adewale Ogunsanya, the landlord of that market, and a great deal more, besides a wealthy, well-fed man in his middle 50s who owned the land the stall stood on, collected the rents, and sat at the head of the Traders' Association, addressed as chief by everyone who needed anything from him, which was everyone. He was not, to look at him, a wicked man. He gave to his church and spoke beautifully about community and trust whenever there was a microphone in front of him. But under the fine agbada and the easy public warmth, he was a man who had never once imagined he could be the one in the wrong, and who measured every soul in his market by what they could pay him and what trouble they could cause him. The cruelty in that reign did not come from a criminal. It came from a respectable big man protecting his name and his comfort. which is a colder and more dangerous thing. And there was one more person who matters, though no one was watching him that morning, because he was the kind of person the market had been taught never to suspect. Chief Ogunsanya had a grown son named Tunde, a smooth, restless young man in his late 20s, who wore good clothes and drove a car his father had bought, and did very little anyone could name. Tunde had been given the soft jobs of a rich man's son. He was meant to help run the market's affairs, to keep the office, to hold a set of the keys, and he carried himself with the easy entitlement of a boy who had never been told no. What no one knew, because he had hidden it behind the good clothes and the careless smile, was that Tunde Ogunsanya was drowning in gambling debt, that he owed frightening sums to frightening people, and that he had been looking for weeks, with a quiet desperation, at the one place in his father's market, where a large amount of cash sat gathered and waiting, the thrift savings of the market women, 3 months deep, soon to be paid out. His trouble was about to find its chance, and a poor woman's clean name was about to be the cover for it. The savings were not small to the women who had made them. 3 months of daily contributions from scores of traders, scraped coin by coin out of thin takings, came to a real sum, the largest pool of cash that market ever held in one place. Because such a sum could not safely sit in a wooden box in an open stall, there had been an arrangement. Each evening, after Folasade counted the day's contributions and entered them in the ledger before the night watchman, the cash itself was carried to the market office and locked in the strongroom for safekeeping, the office that Chief Ogunsanya owned, and that his son Tunde kept the keys to. Folasade kept the book. The Ogunsanyas kept the room, and that division, the poor woman holding the record, and the rich man's household holding the money, was the whole shape of what was about to happen. The careful had been made to account for everything, and given power over nothing. The powerful held everything, and were asked to account for nothing. It happened the night before the payout, when the strongroom held all 3 months at once. Folasade had done as she always did, taken the last day's contributions, written each one in the ledger with its thumbprint, and watched the day's cash carried to the office and locked away, the book balanced and the total agreed, witnessed as it was every single night. She went back to her kiosk and slept in the narrow room with her child, the ledger under her pillow, knowing to the last coin what the market was owed. And in the dark hours of that night, while she slept, the money left the strongroom, not broken into from outside, not forced, but opened with a key by someone who had every right to be in that office, and no right at all to what was inside it. By the time the gray morning came, and the women gathered in the rain to be paid, the strongroom was empty, the cash of 3 months gone, and the only question the market would ask was not how it had left a locked room the poor woman could not enter, but how to make the poor woman pay. The cry went up at first light. The savings were gone. 3 months of the market's money vanished, and the gray morning tilted in an instant from a day of payment into a day of panic. And Chief Adewale Ogunsanya, who had run that market for 20 years and knew exactly how to keep trouble from sticking to his own house, did what such men do. He looked for the answer that would cost him the least, and his eyes landed precisely where you would expect. Not on his own office, not on the strongroom only his household could open, not on his smooth, indebted son who held the keys, on the poor woman in the faded wrapper who kept the book. Folasade kept the thrift, he said, in a voice pitched to carry over the whole frightened crowd. The savings are gone, and she is the one who held them. Where is your money, market? Ask her. Ask the woman you trusted. And the awful machinery of it began, because it is the oldest move there is. When the rich man's house loses something, find the poorest hand that touched it. Folasade stepped forward into the rain with her heart pounding and the ledger clutched to her chest, and she said, plainly and steadily, that she had not taken the savings, that she had counted the money into the strongroom the night before in front of the watchman, as she did every night, and that everything the market had put in was written in the book, every naira, with every woman's own thumb beside it. And that, she would think later, was the first hard lesson of that morning, that she had the whole truth, written and witnessed in her hands, and that it did not matter yet at all, because the crowd was frightened, and the chief was loud, and a book in the hands of a poor woman is a quieter thing than a great man's accusing voice. The chief did not so much as glance at the ledger. "Books," he said, throwing the word away with contempt. "Anyone can write figures in a book. The figures do not feed my market. Where is the cash?" And the crowd, hungry and afraid, took up his contempt, because a poor woman, with a book full of her own writing, is a story a frightened market can be talked out of believing. And Chief Ogunsanya did not hesitate, did not pause, did not ask a single honest question of his own house. He had his answer, and his answer kept the blame far from his office and his son, and that was all he required of the truth. "Thief," he said, loud enough for the whole market and the lane beyond to hear. "She has eaten your savings. I always said it was too much money to leave with one small trader. Did I not say it? You trusted her, and she has robbed you." He turned and performed his outrage, telling them how he had warned against this, how his own heart bled for the traders she had cheated, and he ordered her kiosk locked and her goods seized against the loss. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, beautifully dressed and careful to look as shaken as everyone else, stood his son Tunde, arranging his face into the right shape of dismay, and no one at all, was looking at him, which was exactly as he had needed it to be. Folasade tried once more to be heard. She held the ledger up, open, the rain spotting its pages, and she said the proof was right here, that anyone who could read could see every contribution recorded and balanced to the very night before, that the money had been locked in the chief's own office and not in her stall, and that she did not even hold the key to the room it had vanished from. And for a moment the open book and the plain words made the nearer women hesitate. But the chief moved fast over that hesitation, because a man like that knows a doubt must be crushed before it spreads. "So now it is my fault?" he thundered, turning her words into an insult against himself. "The thief accuses the man whose ground she trades on? You hear her, caught with the loss in her hands, and she points at her betters." And the crowd, which would rather blame a stranger than be told its money was gone for good, swung back to him, and the small hesitation died, and Folasade lowered the book and went very still and very straight, which the crowd read as guilt, and which was in truth the last dignity of a woman who has understood she is alone in the rain. So they locked her kiosk with the small stock she lived on inside it, and barred her from the stall where she slept with her child, and the women who had trusted her turned their backs, and some of the angrier ones spat words at her as they passed, that she had taken food from their children's mouths, that she had pretended to be holy while she robbed them. Folasade gathered her child and the cloth ledger and the little bundle of things they were allowed to take, and she walked out of that market in the rain with her back straight and the whole community's hatred at her back. A woman who in 2 years had not kept back a single coin of theirs, driven out as the one who had eaten everything. She did not weep where they could see her. She lifted her chin, and she held the book, and she went. This is the moment the channel was built to make you feel. So sit with it for one breath before we go on. Because if you have ever done everything right and kept every promise and still watched a frightened crowd believe the loud lie of a powerful man over the quiet truth in your own hands, then you already know exactly how that rain felt on Folasade's neck as she walked out. If you've made it this far into Folasade's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She did not break down on the road. She found shelter with a distant cousin in a poorer part of the city, and she went to the market elders the chief had handed the matter to, and stood before them with her ledger and told the same plain story, that the money had been counted and locked in the chief's office, and that her book balanced to the last night, and they listened the way comfortable men listen to a poor woman. The big man has already condemned, politely, briefly, and with their minds made up. The chief was the chief. The money was gone. The case to everyone but her was closed. And in the borrowed room at night, Folasade came as low as she had ever been, because it is one thing to be poor, and another thing entirely, to be made a thief for a theft you did not commit, to have a clean name, the one treasure the poor can truly own, torn away as easily as a wooden box is emptied. She sat with the cloth ledger held against her in the dark, and felt, for the first time, something close to despair. And then, because despair was a thing she could not afford with a child to raise, she opened the book. For here is the thing Chief Ogunsanya had forgotten, in his contempt, and the thing that would undo him. He had thrown away the word books, as if writing were nothing, because he was a man for whom an accusation had always been enough, and proof had never once been required. It did not occur to him, as it does not occur to such men, that the poor woman he had so easily condemned had spent 2 years building, line by line and thumbprint by thumbprint, the one thing he could not shout down, a complete, dated, witnessed record of every coin the market had ever entrusted to her. He saw a book of figures in a poor woman's hand and called it worthless. But the book did not care how loudly he sneered. The book had simply written down the truth every day as it happened, and the truth it held was that the savings had been counted whole, correct and entire, right up to the night they vanished from a room Folasade Bello did not have a key to. And there was someone who knew how to make that book speak. In the poorer quarter where Folasade had taken shelter, lived an older man her cousin knew, a retired bank cashier named Pa Gabriel Adeyemi, a quiet, upright widower in his 60s who had spent more than 30 years behind a teller's counter, counting other people's money to the last kobo, and never once being short. He had heard the talk of the market thief, as the whole quarter had, and being the kind of man he was, he had also noticed the bearing of the woman it was said about, too straight, too calm, too careful with her own child for the story to sit right with him. When her cousin mentioned that the accused woman had kept a ledger and swore by it, something in the old cashier's professional soul woke up. A ledger, thumbprints, daily entries. He asked, in his courteous way, whether he might see it. And Folasade, who had shown that book to elders who would not read it, and a crowd that would not believe it, handed it at last to a man who had spent his whole life knowing exactly what a book of figures was worth. Pa Gabriel sat down with the ledger under a good lamp, and he did the thing nobody in that market had been willing to do, because they had not wanted the truth, only a culprit. He read it, not glanced at it, read it, page by page, line by line, adding as he went, reconciling the daily contributions, checking the running balance forward from the first page to the last, matching the thumbprints against the names, tracing every sum from the day Folasade took over the Thrift to the last entry the night before the money vanished. And the longer he read, the straighter he sat, because the book was perfect. It balanced. Every naira the women had ever contributed was accounted for, recorded on the day it came in, witnessed by the contributor's own thumb, carried forward to a final, exact total, a total that matched, to the coin, what should have been sitting in that strong room the night it was emptied. The figures did not show a thief skimming the savings over months. They showed a sum kept whole and honest, right up to the moment it left a locked room the woman who kept the book could not open. The cold, clean certainty of it settled into the old cashier, the certainty he had felt 100 times across a teller's counter when the numbers told the truth a person was trying to hide. This woman had not stolen anything. Whatever had happened to that money had happened after the book closed and inside the strong room, in the few dark hours between the last honest entry and the empty morning, and only one household held the key to that room. It was as plain to him as a column that adds correctly. The loss had not happened where the poor woman could reach, but where only the powerful family could. The frightened market had been looking at the keeper of the record. The truth was sitting with the holders of the room. This was the turn, the moment a poor woman's ruin became a thing that could be undone. But Pa Gabriel, who understood institutions, knew that a balanced ledger pointed at the strong room, but did not by itself name the hand that opened it. So he asked a question the panicking market never had. Who had access to the room the money vanished from? And was there any record of that room being opened? Because a strong room in a market office is not a thing one strolls into. It has a key, and a key has a keeper. And such an office very often keeps a register, a logbook of who entered after hours, signed at the gate by the night watchman. If such a register existed, then the same night the book closed on a perfect balance, something else had been written down too. The name of whoever had gone into that office in the dark. And there was such a register, though the chief had forgotten it. The way the powerful forget the small records, the careful keep beneath them. The market office had a night watchman, a poorly paid older man who kept, as he had been told years before, and never told to stop, a plain exercise book in which anyone entering the office after hours wrote their name and the time. He was the same watchman who witnessed Folasade count the cash into the strong room each evening. And he had liked the careful woman and been troubled by her disgrace. When Pa Gabriel asked, courteously, whether anyone had gone into the office the night the savings vanished, the watchman grew frightened because he knew the answer and whose son it was. The register showed in his own laborious hand that late on the night before the payout, hours after Folasade had counted the money in and gone to sleep, one person had signed for the key to the strong room, Tunde Ogunsanya, the chief's son. And his fear breaking under the old cashier's steady kindness, the watchman told the rest, that he had seen the young master go to the strong room and leave again before dawn with a heavy bag he had not come with, and had said nothing, because a poor watchman who accuses the landlord's son does not keep his job or his health for long. So now there were two records that fit together, like a key in a lock. A thrift ledger that balanced to the last coin up to that very night, proving the money had been whole when it was locked away, and an office register signed by the chief's own son, proving whose hand had opened the room in the dark. The careful poor had kept, between them, the exact proof the powerful had never thought they would need. But there was the question of how the truth would be told, and Pa Gabriel, who understood power as well as numbers, made certain it would not be told. In a way the chief could manage quietly, a private word, a quiet repayment to soften the loudest traders. The charge never formally withdrawn, the sun shielded. The whole thing smoothed over, so that Folasade carried the shadow of it forever, even if no one ever again said the word thief to her face. He had seen that ending, and he would not have it here. The accusation had been made in the open, before the whole market, in the rain. The truth, he decided, would be read out just as openly, before the same people, where it could not be buried. And the chance came, because the market itself demanded it. The loss of 3 months of savings could not simply be swallowed. The women were ruined and furious, and the Traders' Association was forced to call a full gathering. Every trader, the elders, the chief presiding, the whole market assembled in the open square to settle the matter of the stolen thrift, and what was to be done about the woman who had taken it. The watchman was summoned. Pa Gabriel asked to be allowed to examine the accounts, an old cashier offering his help, and the association, wanting to look thorough, agreed, not knowing what he carried. Chief Adewale Ogunsanya believed he was convening a gathering to confirm a poor woman's guilt and close the matter cleanly. He did not know that the meeting he had called to bury Folasade was about to become the place his own house was opened, nor that Folasade herself, with the old cashier beside her and the watchman ready to speak, would be standing in that square to face the market that had driven her out. The day came, and the whole market gathered in the open square under a hot, bright sky. The elders seated, the chief at the head of them grave and in command, speaking smoothly of the painful business of the stolen savings, and of how the market must be firm with the thief so that trust could be restored. The women sat in rows, hurt and hard-faced. And then there was a stir, and Folasade Bello walked into the square, not slinking, not begging, but upright in a clean, plain wrapper, with her head wrapped neat, the cloth ledger in her hands, the old cashier Pa Gabriel at her side, and the frightened watchman behind them. A murmur of outrage went up that the thief had dared to come, and the chief was on his feet at once, demanding to know what she was doing there, ordering her put out. And it was then that Pa Gabriel stepped forward and asked in the courteous, unhurried voice of a man who has counted money for 30 years and has all the proof he needs, whether the gathering would permit an old bookkeeper to read out the accounts of the thrift before anyone decided anything. Because, he said, the savings had a record, and the record had something to say. The elders, wanting to appear just before the whole market, allowed it over the chief's objection, and Pa Gabriel opened the ledger where everyone could see and began to read, plainly, patiently, name by name. And as he read, women in the crowd heard their own names and their own daily sums, the exact coins they had handed over, each followed by their own thumbprint pressed in the book, and a stillness began to spread, because every figure was right. He carried the running total forward week by week. The whole market, hearing its own savings, counted back to it correctly, until he arrived at the final entry, the night before the money vanished, and announced the total the book reached. The exact sum that should have been locked in that strong room that night, every naira accounted for. Nothing skimmed. The thrift kept whole and honest to the last coin. The book did not show a thief, he said into the silence. It showed a woman who had balanced the savings entire, up to the very night they disappeared from a locked room she did not hold the key to. So the question was not whether Folasade had eaten the savings. The book proved she had not. The question was, who had opened that room after the book closed? And then Pa Gabriel turned to the watchman and asked him gently to tell the gathering what he had written in his register that night and whom he had let into the office. The old watchman, shaking, with the whole market staring, opened his plain exercise book and read out his own laborious entry. That late on the night before the payout, hours after the savings were counted in and locked away, one person had signed for the key to the strongroom and gone in. And he said the name aloud, into the breathless square. Tunde Ogunsanya, the chief's son, and then, his voice cracking, he told the rest. That he had seen the young master go to the strongroom and leave before dawn with a heavy bag, and that he had been too afraid to speak while they branded the innocent woman. The square made a sound like a single indrawn breath, and every face in it turned slowly from the poor woman they had condemned to the chief at the head of the gathering, and the smooth son beside him, who had gone the color of ash. Chief Ogunsanya tried, of course. They always try. He blustered that the watchman was lying, that the book could have been altered, that this was a poor woman's trick to escape her crime, that no one would take the word of a gateman over a chief. But the words had no ground to stand on, because the market had just heard its own savings counted back correct to the last coin, in its own members' names and thumbprints, and had just heard the chief's own son named in the office's own register as the one who entered the strongroom in the dark. The contempt the chief had used to crush Folasade in the rain had simply changed direction and turned back on his house. And under the weight of all those turning faces and the two plain records that fit together like a lock and its key, the sun broke. Tunde Ogunsanya, cornered before the whole market, his careful smile gone, confessed it in a rush. The gambling debts he had hidden, the dangerous men he owed, the savings he had taken because they were sitting there, and he had the key, and the poor woman he had let them blame because, he said, and the square flinched to hear it, no one would ever question the chief's son, and everyone was so ready to believe the worst of her. And it was then that Folasade spoke, for the first time, into the silence. She did not shout, and she did not weep, and she did not point. She said simply that she had told them the truth in the rain, that she had counted the money into the chief's own strongroom, and written every coin in the book, and never once touched what was not hers, and that not one of them had been willing to hear it, because it had been easier to believe a poor woman was a thief than to ask who held the key to the room the money vanished from. She said that she had kept that ledger honest for 2 years, every thumbprint, every coin, not because anyone made her, but because their trust was the one thing she had, and that they had thrown it away in a single morning on the word of a powerful man who had not so much as opened the book. She turned to Chief Ogunsanya, who could not meet her eyes, and said that he had called her a thief from a height where no one argued, to keep the blame from his own house, and that a market full of people who had known her for years had believed him over their own knowledge of her, and that the only thing that had saved her was a book they refused to read, and an old man willing to read it. She said it without bitterness, which was the hardest thing of all, and it landed in that square harder than any curse could have. The justice, when it came hard, because the proof was beyond denial, and the people who would normally have buried it had been caught in the open. The matter could no longer be kept inside the market. The savings were a crime against scores of people, and with the ledger balanced, the register signed, the watchman's account given, and the son's own confession heard by the whole gathering, it went where it had to go. Tunde Ogunsanya was handed to the police and charged with the theft of the savings and with the false accusation that had driven an innocent woman from her livelihood and her home. The deliberate ruin of a person who had done nothing, which the law does not treat lightly once it is laid out plainly with names and records. The gambling debts he had hidden came into the open, and the dangerous men he owed were the least of his troubles now. The chief's smooth son, who had thought himself far too well placed to ever be suspected, was taken away in handcuffs, and this time the market's anger was pointed at the right person. And Chief Adewale Ogunsanya did not escape it either, though his ruin was of a slower and more lasting kind. He had built his whole standing on being the chief, the big man whose word settled everything, and he had used that word to brand an innocent woman a thief to shield his own house, and had been proven wrong, publicly, catastrophically, before the entire market he ruled. He had not himself carried the savings out of the strongroom, but he had been the engine of the lie that followed. He had refused to look at his own office, refused to read the book, refused to ask a single question of his own family, and had spent the trust of 200 traders to crush the one person who could least defend herself. The market that had deferred to him for 20 years now saw a man who would sacrifice an innocent to protect his own. And that is a thing a market does not forgive in the one meant to keep it fair. The savings, it was made plain, would be repaid in full from the chief's own pocket and his son's seized assets. There was no hiding from a debt the whole market had heard counted aloud. His chairmanship did not survive it. Quietly, then not so quietly, he lost the head seat he had held for 2 decades. He had spent his power ruining a stranger to save his son, and he lost both, and did not get either back. Folasade did not gloat. She stood in the middle of that square with the ledger in her hands and let the silence be the verdict it was. Having asked for nothing but the truth she had told from the first, because a clean name, she understood now more deeply than ever, is the one thing the poor own that the powerful cannot simply take, so long as somewhere, someone, is willing to read what really happened instead of shouting what is convenient to believe. It did not all knit back together in a single afternoon. These things never do, but it came, and it came fully. Folasade was cleared completely. Before the whole market that had driven her out, her name lifted clean of the charge, and the truth of her honesty made as public as the lie had been. Her kiosk was unlocked and her seized goods returned. And more than that, the Traders' Association, shamed by what its members had done to her, restored her with apology, and the women who had spat words at her in the rain came one by one to beg her pardon, some weeping, ashamed to look at the woman they had so easily condemned. The repayment of the savings, drawn from the chief's pocket and his son's assets, was made in full to every trader, and not one of them lost the season's money in the end, though they had nearly lost something harder to repay, which was the honest woman in their midst. And the market's trust in her did not merely return. It deepened past what it had ever been, because the whole market had now heard, read aloud in its own square, exactly how faithfully she had kept their money. The women would have no one else hold the thrift. They pressed it back into her hands with a new respect, and her standing, which had been that of someone merely tolerated, became that of someone honored. Good custom came to her stall now from people who wanted to trade with the honest woman everyone had heard about, and her small business, which had hung by a thread, steadied and then grew. With the goodwill of the market behind her and her own careful hands, Folasade did at last the thing she had balanced her private little book toward on all those lean nights. She took her child out of the bare back room and into a proper home with a real floor, paid the school fees without fear, and put her own honest savings toward a second stall, the beginning of a real trade, with her own name behind it. The promise she had made by the lamp, that whatever else was poor about their lives, no one would ever truly be able to say her name was not clean, she had kept against everything, at the cost of her home and her livelihood, and very nearly her whole future, and she had kept it. She kept faith, too, with the ones who had stood by her when she was nothing. most of all with Pa Gabriel Adeyemi, who had owed her nothing and risked the chief's anger to do the simple, rare thing of reading the truth and telling it, and with the frightened watchman who had at last found the courage to speak. And she did a thing that set right something larger than herself. She knew, because she had lived it, how easily the careful poor are made to carry the blame for the powerful, how a woman who keeps the records and holds none of the power is always the first one offered up when something goes wrong. So she changed the thrift and made it safe for whoever kept it after her. The cash would no longer sit where one household held the only key. The counting would be witnessed by more than one trader. The book would be read aloud to the whole thrift each month, so that the record was the market's and not one fragile woman's to be doubted, and so that no keeper of the savings after her could ever be branded a thief in the rain on the word of a big man who refused to read the book. There was an evening, months after, the day's trade done and her own stall quiet, and her child asleep with a real floor beneath her, when Folasade sat by a good lamp and opened the worn cloth ledger she had carried out of that market in the rain, the same book a powerful man had thrown away the word for, the same book that had spoken when she could not. And she did not feel afraid this time, and she was not bitter this time. She turned the pages full of her own careful figures and the thumbprints of 200 trusting women, and she understood that the book had been the truth of her all along, that under the faded wrapper and through every cruel word, what she really was had never changed, a woman who counted honest and kept her word to the last coin, and that no loud lie thrown down from a height had ever been able to make that untrue. She closed the ledger gently and set it on her own table in her own home, and it was not nothing, and it had never been nothing. So here is what I would leave with you tonight before the light goes. The world will always find it easier to blame the hand that kept the record than to question the house that held the key, and quicker to believe a poor woman ate the savings than to ask who could open the locked room in the dark. But the truth of what a person did and did not do leaves a mark the convenient story cannot erase, and sometimes that mark is kept by something as humble and patient as a worn book of thumbprints, and read at last by someone willing to count. They called her a thief and emptied her stall, and the same market that condemned her was made to hear the truth read aloud, line by line, until the lie could not stand. So I will ask you this, and I will be reading every answer. If you had been Folasade Bello, branded a thief in the rain, and driven from your home for a theft you did not commit, your clean name and your good standing torn away on the word of a powerful man, would you have broken and let them make you what they said you were? Or would you have done what she did, kept your composure and your honest book, and waited for the one person willing to read the truth? Tell me honestly which of those two you are. That was tonight's tale from beneath the Baobab. If the truth in it moved you, come sit with us again.